All right, so we're going to be talking about morality today, and this is actually like a presentation I've been working on here and there for a while, and it's something I've been wanting to talk about for a while because I think it's really important, and it's something that I find comes up constantly, for me anyway, that I just find myself in these moral discussions with both believers and unbelievers, but especially, the conversations I have with unbelievers. Things always seem to turn towards like questions of morality. And I call this a street level guide to the morality debate, because this isn't going to be a really like precisely laid out philosophical argument. I'm not trained in philosophy, so I'm not the best guy for that. There is something called the moral argument, which is an apologetic argument that uses morality to argue for the existence of God. And we're going to be talking about that too, but I decided to call this the morality debate because I think it goes deeper than just this one argument. There's a lot of things connected to this that we can talk about. So this is like a lot of this is just based on things I've read, but also things I've wrestled with myself and things that have come up in conversations with people. So hopefully you can benefit from some of my experience with talking about this stuff. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to do. We're going to just do a quick overview about morality, just some basics. And then we're really going to focus on this idea of subjective morality versus objective morality, because really that's a huge thing. And then we're going to look at the biblical worldview and then the atheistic worldview, and what kind of grounding do they give us for morality. And obviously there's many other worldviews, but they're the two big worldviews, at least in American culture. And, and these arguments and things we're going to talk about, we really can apply to any worldview. And I'm also going to talk about what I call the atheist dilemma when it comes to morality. And then I'll give you some discussion tips or maybe even debate tips if someone's really kind of railing at you about things. And then when we're doing that, we'll look at some alternative atheist explanations for where morality comes from. Okay, so that's a little overview of what we're doing. So let me ask you a question first. When it comes to morality, there's a lot of cultural discussions and debates going on right now. What are some of the big topics that you hear the most?
Gay rights.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely a big one that comes up. And
abortion,
yep.
Right now, systemic racism.
Yeah, definitely a big one.
Immigration laws.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's not too long ago was the big Me Too movement started, right? So things like sexism and sexual harassment, things like that, like said, abortion, racism, homosexuality. These are all very big things. And I mean, even outside of those kind of cultural things, there's a lot of moral condemnation going on of different political figures and different political groups and things like that. So my point is we really can't escape discussions about morality. Even if you don't think, you're a person that really focuses that on a lot, it's pretty much unavoidable. So there's two big reasons why I think this talk and thinking about this stuff is so important. And one is I don't know a single person who doesn't ever make any moral claims. Like, I don't care if the person, what their worldview is, everybody makes moral claims. And the second reason I think this is so important is I do think it's an extremely compelling and powerful argument for believing in God, and especially the God of the Bible. So So the moral argument, it comes in different forms. There's different ways people lay it out, but this is kind of the philosophical argument or the apologetic argument that's often stated. So this is one form of it. It just goes, every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. And then another version of this goes, if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. So we're going to look at this as we go, but obviously we need to unpack number one and number two in order to be able to reach the third conclusion, therefore God exists. Everybody good so far? All right, so here's a little overview, just some things to consider and think about as we, as we talk about these things. I'm just trying to, but there we go again. Sorry, I'm just trying to move some stuff around. First of all, we can't really talk about morality without talking about these other related things. And I find whenever you have a talk about morality, whether you mean to or not, these other things come into the discussion. So purpose and meaning is important, because really if there's no purpose or meaning behind anything, you really can't make any moral claims about it. And again, we'll unpack this as we go. Obviously, we can't talk about morality without talking about human value and dignity, and we can't talk about morality without talking about things like rights and fairness and justice. So all these things are almost interchangeable in what we're going to talk about today. They're all related. They're so closely related that I'm just going to put them all under the category of morality. And then when we talk about morality, this is a little helpful to think about. There's really two big categories under morality. The first one has to do with moral value or worth, like the worth of a person or an action. And the other one would be moral duty, and that comes down to obligation. So our obligation or lack of obligation to act in a certain way. And one way to think about this is what we ought or ought not do, right? So moral value, so that has to do with worth, and moral duty, which has to do with obligation. So when we talk about morality, we have to answer questions like this. Where do we get ideas of worth and obligation? So when we're talking about moral value, we ask, how do you measure the worth of a person or an action? So when someone makes a claim about, people have rights, it's like, well, where does that come from? Where do we get this idea? How do we measure the worth of a person or an action? And then when we're talking about moral duties, the big question is, where do obligations to act in a certain way come from? In other words, how do we know what we ought or ought not to do? So any worldview that's making any moral claims, and like I said, all people make moral claims, need to be able to answer these questions. And along with these are just more general questions like this. Where is your morality rooted? Meaning there needs to be some source of that morality. What is the source? I already covered that. And then another question you could throw out is, according to what authority or standard? So again, if you think about it, this was, some of us been in a book club reading God's Crime Scene by J. Warner Wallace, and he brought this up in the chapter about morality, where he said, a lot of people, might appeal to a higher authority for why you should follow the law and obey it, right? So they might first talk about local law, and then you could get to like state law, and then work your way up to like federal law. Or a lot of times conversations about rights, we go to the United States Constitution as the authority. So then the question is there authority higher than that? What is that rooted in, right? So it's kind of, you can keep asking this question, well, where do you get that idea? What is that rooted in? And you push it back even more. So according to what authority or standard, what is the source of your morals? Okay, is everybody good so far? That's just some basics to get us started in thinking. All right, so let's talk about subjective versus objective. So this is really important. So when we talk about morality, we can talk about subjective morality or objective morality. Subjective essentially means it's true only for the individual, and truth lies within the individual. And this is sometimes also called moral relativism. So essentially it means like me, Stephen, create my own morality, and then, Christina creates her own morality, and Voss creates his own morality, right? So it's subjective, where objective means truth exists independent of the individual. So the truth lies outside the individual. So that's a big difference. So in this case, we have one guy saying, yo, that vase is ugly. And then the woman is saying that vase is as tall as me. So, this is easy, but it'd be nice to hear someone once in a while so I know I'm not talking to myself. Which one is making the subjective claim and which one is making an objective claim or statement?
The person on the left is making a subjective claim.
The man?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he's making a subjective claim. He thinks the vase is ugly. That's his opinion. You can't really argue that. It's just like, well, that's what he thinks. Where the woman is making an objective claim. The truth is based on the object, not the subject, right? So that vase is clearly as tall as her. And that is something that's a fact that exists outside of her that can be proven. Now, keep in mind, like sometimes people think like objective claims are just purely opinion. There's no way to argue them, but obviously there's some opinions that are more valid than others that can be debated. If you say, I think so-and-so is the greatest baseball player ever lived, you can then lay out reasons why you believe that. So even though it's a subjective claim, there are, stronger opinions than others that can be based with arguments and support. But just saying a vase is ugly, I guess he could lay out maybe why he thinks it's ugly. But when you get down to it, a statement like that is pretty subjective. It's really just like, okay, if that's what you feel, right? So when we're looking at subjective, each person creates their own morality. So if you think about it, their morality is kind of originating with them and going out into the world. Where objective morality, there's some sort of law outside of themselves, and that law, they are all under that law, right? They're all obligated to conform to that law and live by that. So you could have the objective moral statement, murder is wrong. And if that's objective, that means that everyone is under that obligation to believe murder is wrong and live appropriately. But when we're talking about subjective morality, one person might think murder is wrong and another, but then, someone might think murder is fun. And then we run into an issue, right? Because they're creating their own morality, and really subjectively, again, they can't argue with her, obviously, and give out reasons why they should think murder shouldn't be fun. But if she feels like murder is fun, that's how she feels, right? So you see the issue there. So when it comes to subjectivism, the problem is any statement anybody says, like blank lives matter, fill in the blank, you can't tell me who to love, don't oppress my freedom, my body, my right coexist. When it comes to subjectivism, for the most part, we can pretty much just respond like, well, that's just your opinion. By what standard are you basing this on other than your personal thoughts or feelings? Why should I really care? According to what standard? All right, so we're a Christian ministry, so let's take some time to talk about morality in the biblical worldview. So again, we have to answer these questions. Where is your morality rooted? What is the source of it? And according to what authority or standard can we make these statements? So obviously the Christian believes in objective morality. There's an objective standard morality, and that is the God of the Bible. So obviously when we read the Bible, we find clear statements about how we should and shouldn't act, how we ought and ought not to act. We have the Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, and then many other passages other than those. But also, when you get down to it, like I said, morality is about things like purpose and meaning, human value and dignity, rights, fairness, and justice. And again, in the Christian worldview, we find grounds for all of those in the God of the Bible. So Genesis 1:27 tells us, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created him, them. So right here at the very beginning of the Bible, we're told that both male and female are made in God's image. So this immediately lets us know that humans are inherently valuable. All humans are inherently valuable, and we see this teaching throughout the Bible. So you even have in James's letter where he says we're not even to curse people, because why would we use the same mouth we use to bless God or to praise God, and use that same mouth to curse humans that are made in God's image? So we see that that this teaching, even earlier in Genesis, it talks about that we should not murder because people are made in God's image. But James goes so far as to say we're not even to speak badly about people because they're made in God's image. So this tells us right off the bat that humans are inherently valuable. So again, that is grounding for human rights and for self-respect and human value and purpose. We also have the creation mandate right in Genesis 1, which is where God tells us to go and be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth. He makes us stewards of the earth. So that right there gives us purpose rooted in God. Romans 5:8 tells us God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, saved by him from the wrath of God. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son. So I like to say that the Genesis 1:27 shows us that all humans are inherently valuable. And then I like to say passages like Romans 5:8 through 10 here, and any passages that speak about the gospel itself, show us that all humans are eternally valuable, right? Because God wants us to be in relationship with him for eternity, so much so that the third person of the Trinity came down and humbled himself to the point of death on a cross for us. So here we have human value, inherent value, and like I said, I like to say eternal human value. We also have Matthew 22. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So again, this gives us purpose. This tells us how we ought to act. And then we also have the Great Commission in Matthew 28. After Jesus rises from the dead, he tells his disciples to go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So again, this gives us purpose. It gives us focus. And I always love this from the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Obviously, this isn't scripture, but it sums up scripture in this just nice little saying that our purpose is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I just always love that, so I had to put that in there. We have Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So again, we have grounds for justice and kindness, to be humble. And then we also have the Christian concept of the final judgment, where we believe Christ will return and all people stand before him and be judged. So again, we have this concept of justice. And we could go on and on about all of these things. But as you can see, in the Christian worldview, we have grounds for morality, we have grounds for human value and worth, we have grounds for things like justice and fairness and and all that. So now one one thing that is brought up sometimes to debate against Christians, it actually goes way back to Plato, is a euthyphro. I knew I was going to mispronounce it. Euthyphro dilemma, and essentially it goes like this: one, if is something good because God wills it, right? So essentially, is something good because God wills it, and therefore it's only good. It's good because it's arbitrary. And essentially, it's just because God decides it's good, right? So if God decides tomorrow, like rape is good, is it simply good just because he wills it, right? So then that means, like I said, if he just decides what's good, it's totally arbitrary. But if God wills something, the question goes, does God will something because it's good? So essentially, if God wills it because the thing is already good, then that means morality is independent of God. So I did a really bad job of explaining that, but hopefully you get the idea. Any questions on that? Right, so yeah, like the argument goes, there's really just two options. If God just wills it, and then it's good, it's totally arbitrary. If it's good, so God wills it, then morality is independent of God. So it's like this objective thing that just exists independent of God, and that doesn't seem to fit into the Christian worldview. The quick response to this is really that's a false dichotomy, okay? That's really just saying, hey, there's these only two choices, and really there is a third, and I would say the accurate biblical and Christian answer is God by his very character and nature is good, so therefore God is the standard of good, and thus God wills something because he is good. You know, but God is the standard and the source of all that's good. All right, so let's talk about atheism a little. The problem with, and now this is, and probably some of you have hung around with me long enough have heard me talk about this. You know, when I was an atheist, I essentially, you know, I wasn't like into reading philosophy or anything like that, but when I started thinking things out and thinking about what I actually believed about life and the world and the universe, I essentially started coming to the conclusion that their morality was just an illusion. And pretty much the way of thinking goes like this. You know, the Christian or the atheistic worldview, or we could say the materialistic or the naturalistic, meaning there's no supernatural, there's no spiritual realm, really everything is just physical stuff. So it's just the universe and everything is just made out of physical stuff. So the universe, you know, came into existence out of nothing for absolutely no reason. So you're going to have no purpose there. There's no design behind the universe, and therefore there's no purpose. And also, you know, when you read science, the universe will ultimately fizzle out. Like it'll run out of energy, and it just, you know, like everything, you know, all the stars will burn out, and life on Earth or wherever else it might be in the universe will die as well. And along with this, life itself is a result of time and chance. So again, no purpose or design behind it. Again, when we look at this worldview, there's really no significant distinction between humans and animals, or really anything else. I mean, we're just a bunch of humans are just a bunch of chemicals and stuff and physical stuff, just like, you know, a rock or something. Now we can argue, well, you know, humans are further along on the evolutionary in the evolutionary process than say some moss, but we're still pretty much the same stuff. We also, all life is going to end up in the same place. It's all going to die. We're all going to end up worm food. And also there's no ultimate justice, right? Essentially, you could be the worst person in the world, and you could be the greatest person in the world, and you're both going to end up in the same place, right? You could be Mother Teresa or Hitler, you end up in the same exact place. So, and this isn't just my opinion. I mean, this is a very famous quote from Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous atheist in the world right now. I wouldn't say he's if you wanted to read the best arguments for atheism or against religion, he's really not the guy to go to, but he's probably the most vocal one that you're going to hear about. But he very famously said, the universe we observe has no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So notice the stuff he says, right? There's no design, there's no purpose, and therefore there's no good or evil. Just the universe, life itself is just blind and pitiless and indifferent. And then he even, talks about DNA. Essentially, we're just pre-programmed, flesh robots, and we just dance to the music of our DNA. So we really have no free will. So essentially, where do you get morality out of that, right? He himself says, no evil and no good. There is no morality in this worldview. A video I watched by Lawrence Krauss, who's another very outspoken atheist. In this video, he talked about how human life is more insignificant than we can possibly imagine, and that we're an accident in a remote corner of the universe. And then he goes on to talk about the imminent death of all life in the universe. So again, if we're insignificant, we're just an accident in the remote corner of the universe, and essentially we're all going to die. Again, where do you get morality in that? So I often say, both to my atheist friends and others who are willing to listen to me, that atheists have no grounding for morality. Now, let me just say a little side thing, because usually when people hear this, what they hear is I'm saying atheists have no morality. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that an atheist can have morals or doesn't live according to morals, because I know a lot of perfectly moral, by human standards, atheists. I know a lot of great people who are not Christians, okay? That is not what I'm saying, but I'm saying they have no grounding. They have no philosophical grounding according to what they believe in the world for morality. So they can make moral claims, but they can't defend them. They can't explain to us where they come from or why we should even listen or care according to their worldview. Okay, so a very good apologetic technique is to crawl into the person's head and look at the world through their worldview. So we just talked about the Christian worldview. So if, and atheists have done this to me, they'll crawl into the Christian worldview and critique Christianity from the inside and try to point out where it's hypocritical or something. And, we can do the same thing to the atheist worldview. So the question comes up is, can atheists be good without God? So let's look at some biblical scripture about this, some biblical ideas, and see what you guys think. Can atheists be good without God? Well, I pretty much just answered that, honestly. I said, yeah, I think they can be by human standards. So we're told, Jesus himself says no one is good except God alone. And then we're also told in Scripture, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But again, going back to Genesis 1:27, we're also told that all people are made in the image of God. And so even though we are fallen and we all have sinned and we're none of us are purely good as God is, we can still do good things. We can do things that are still, even if we're a hardcore atheist, we can still do things and likely do things that are in line with the purposes God created us for. Okay, you guys are probably getting sick of hearing me talk, so let me get a volunteer to read this, please. I'm going to call on someone. Okay, go ahead.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools Therefore, God gave them up. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them.
Okay, so this is, I mean, we could spend a lot of time just unpacking this, but it talks about that God has made himself clearly perceived in the natural world. But yeah, essentially people have turned away from him and have embraced a lie. And it's interesting, it says 3 times in this passage that God gave them up. It seems like there's eventually a point where God will say, okay, well, if this is what you want, I'm going to let you have it. So this is just something to think about as we talk about some of this. Eric, you mind reading this one too? This one's a little more directly related to what we're talking about.
Eric, you're muted.
Do we lose Eric?
No, I was muted. Thanks, Christina. For when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature, do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day, when according to the gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ
Okay,
Jesus.
so this one's a little more directly significant to what we're talking about, or at least the point I'm trying to make here. Thanks, Eric, by the way. But here it's talking about the Gentiles, meaning the non-Christians and the non-Jews, have God's law written on their heart, and talks about their conscience, right? So again, this is the image of God in them has a conscience. They know there's things that are morally wrong and morally right. So when we take into account that all people are image bearers, again, that means there is good in all people and they can do all good. And they know certain things by instinct about God and morality. But also within the atheist worldview, I find the atheist worldview just doesn't match with what God created us to be, right? It's a very different worldview than the Christian worldview, and they can't exist essentially in both and be consistent. So think about it this way: whether the atheist believes in God or not, he lives in God's creation. So when he denies that, he's going to start contradicting himself. So I often call it moral schizophrenia. I've noticed that when you have a long enough, and I've said, again, some of you have heard me give talks before, probably have heard me say this before, but if you have a conversation about morality with an atheist long enough, you find that they wind up being very inconsistent and self-contradictory, whether they're making specific moral claims or they're talking about their beliefs about morality and behavior. I've had conversations with atheists who tell me things like, there is no morality, everything we do is selfish, all life's meaningless. And I'll have a conversation with them, and eventually they start making moral claims. So I'm specifically at this moment talking about ones that make those sort of statements where they claim, things like morality is an illusion. So to give an example, and again, if some of you have probably heard me share this before, but I was having a conversation with an atheist, and he was, very much giving me the, there is no truth, there is no morality, everything we do is selfish. Then about half an hour into the conversation, he asked me, what's the hardest part about being a Christian? Which, we were having a friendly conversation. I mean, we were challenging each other, but it was a friendly conversation. And he said, is it understanding the Bible? And I said, no. I said, there's parts of the Bible that are hard to understand, but for the most part, the big ideas of the Bible are very clear. And I said, the hard part for me is living them out consistently. So Jesus tells me to love my neighbors. How do I do that consistently? How does that look on a daily basis? How do I, love my neighbor, period. And then he says to me, well, you know what? You got very kind of thoughtful for a second and said, you know what? I have the same issue. Like I have this yearning to really help people and care for people. And I just don't really do it. So here's a guy that a half hour earlier is telling me there is no morality, that everything we do is selfish. And then once he kind of lets his guard down and we get a little more personal, he tells me how he has this urge to, be a, quote unquote, good person and help others. So one Christian apologist compared this to like if you take a ball and try to push it down into like water, you have to kind of actively hold it down, but when you get distracted and let it go, the ball pops up again. And in a sense, that's the image of God popping out of the atheist, right? So the atheist can say stuff like, well, there is no morality, but then half hour later when he's telling me, he really wants to help people and be more compassionate towards people, and he's that's the image of God popping out of him. So that's the point I'm getting at. But at the same time, I also find people can be inconsistent about specific moral claims if they don't have some sort of objective moral standard they're appealing to outside of themselves. So for example, I think most people would agree murder is wrong, but then I find people are very inconsistent on their stance on abortion. And they'll say things like, well, it's a woman's right to choose. So they're putting, and I just find, when you start digging into that, they are very inconsistent with things. And again, obviously I'm not generalizing, or this is a generalization. I don't mean every atheist. So we're talking about moral schizophrenia. So to give you an example, we have Richard Dawkins once again, who, again, just to remind you, said the universe we observe has no design, no purpose, right? No good or evil. But then he makes comments like this. If your morality is based, as mine is, on a desire to increase the sum of happiness and reduce suffering, the decision to deliberately give birth to a down baby when you have the choice to abort it early in the pregnancy might actually be immoral from the point of view of the child's own welfare. Now, putting aside the whole, thing about aborting a down baby, because obviously we could, that's going to take us down a total side road. But notice he's talking about morality. He's talking about his morality, right? And what's immoral or not moral. So here we have, in one breath, him telling us that there is no good or evil, yet here he's clearly making moral claims. Also in his book, he famously just goes on a rant about the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, and he goes on and on, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, genocidal bully, right? And again, this is all moral condemnation. So again, the man who just told us there is no good and evil has no problem morally condemning the God of the Bible. So again, this is just what I call moral schizophrenia of atheism. So going back to the moral argument we looked at early on, right? If God doesn't exist, objective morals and duties don't exist. Objective morals, values, and duties do exist, therefore God exists. I think we can reword it, and do it another way as well. We could say if atheism is true, objective morality doesn't exist. Objective morality does exist. And now again, we have to defend that statement. We haven't done that yet. 3, therefore atheism is false. And I think that's pretty solid. Another thing, and again, I don't have a philosophy background, so I don't know if this is, philosophers would like the way I laid this out or not, but this is just my thinking. Like I said, this is a street level approach to the moral argument or the moral debate questions. If there is no God, there is no objective morality. If there is no objective morality, all moral claims are personal preference. If all moral claims are personal preference, all other persons are free to reject them. So we end up back here, right? Subjective morality, people making different claims, and we essentially can dismiss them as, well, that's just your opinion, or according to what? Where are you getting this idea from? And it really, when I think about this, it really reminds me of the book of Judges. Now, in the book of Judges, if you read it carefully, there's this ongoing cycle throughout it where everybody turns from God and starts doing some horrendous things. And then God, and then they fall into oppression and chaos. And then God raises up a judge and he gets them back on track of following God. And then another cycle begins where they again turn from God, and then things get even worse. And if you read it carefully, it's this downward spiral. And then you have this repeated refrain in Judges that says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So there was no king leading the people or pointing them to God. And when you have subjectivism, it essentially comes down to that. Everybody's just doing what is right in their own eyes. And essentially, when you have everybody being their own gods and coming up with their own morality, it is really a recipe for chaos. And like I said, you see that in the book of Judges. And really, I think what you start noticing is when there's no objective moral standard that we can all stand on, like there's no common ground to meet on anymore to have discussions about morals, essentially it just comes down to who can exert their power the most. And you see that, I think you're seeing that more and more with American politics, and you've seen it in, many other countries where, well, there's no longer any moral common ground we can meet on. So eventually it just comes down to exertion of power. All right, well, we stopped a little bit ago and talked for quite a bit. I was going to give you some tips on if you're having discussions with people about this. Yeah, so like I said, I'm not a trained philosopher debater, but this is a lot of what I'm about to share is just from a lot of discussions with people about this stuff. And, take it or leave it. It might be helpful to you. It might not be. And this is, like I said, the first time I'm giving this talk. So any helpful feedback is good. Those of you who don't know me, if you think this sounds too aggressive, I threw in the discussion there. It's a discussion guide to morality debate. The first talk of this year I was on, and I gave my talk, don't have a debate, have a discussion. So essentially this fits very nicely into what we covered there, which is essentially, 1 Peter 3:15 is kind of the main verse that apologists like to go to. It says, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So I jokingly call it street fighting, but yeah, I just want to emphasize using God's word that we're always to engage with people with gentleness and respect. And going back to my talk earlier, don't have a debate, have a discussion. A lot of this has to do with just using tactical questions. So that's Greg Koukl's Tactics is an excellent book. A lot of these techniques I got from, thinking about the stuff he teaches. But essentially, you're just using questions. Instead of getting into an argument with someone or even trying to sit there and lay out why you think they're wrong, you're just asking them questions and trying to get them to think it out themselves. So we have the moral argument. If God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. Again, I'm not a trained philosopher who's going to go into super depth on that, but number one, we pretty much covered in the materialistic, naturalistic, atheistic worldview. I don't see any grounds for believing in objective moral values. We will look at some other explanations that I've heard from atheists. So number two, objective moral values and duties do exist. A lot of times that's a debatable topic, right? That's where the sticking point you really have to defend. So the very first quote unquote move to show that objective moral values and duties do exist, and I threw that up there mostly for Voss because I figured only me and Voss are going to appreciate the Karate Kid reference, the original Karate Kid reference. But the famous sweep the leg Johnny. So the for fun leg sweep, and this is essentially when someone says, objective morals don't exist. I mean, if you know the person and, let's keep it honest, the conversations, getting into debates like this with people you don't know really is a waste of time for the most part. Like maybe a few years ago, I would get in, internet debates with people I didn't know, and it's just pointless. Like it's just a waste of your time. You can use your time better doing other things. But if you're having a conversation with someone and it's an honest conversation, and that they hold something very, in very high or low regard morally, you pretty much just say to them, like, thankfully, most people or, the people I'm close to are against racism, right? So I would say to them, well, you believe racism is objectively wrong, right? There's never a time or a place where something like racism is okay. And they usually have to concede. I mean, unless they're pretty headstrong, but I really know very few people are going to say, no, there are times where racism is okay. You get what I'm saying? So if you run into a really headstrong person that's saying, yep, sometimes in certain cultures it's okay, you do the for fun move. So you say, what about abusing someone for fun? Is that ever, is there ever a time where that is acceptable? Or, the big guns, if you really want to pull out the big guns, you use the torturing babies for fun line. You just essentially say, so you're telling me that there may be a time and place where torturing a baby for fun is okay. So essentially what you're doing is asking them questions to try to get them to the point where they are like, okay, there needs to be some moral values. Okay, so that's the leg sweep, the for fun leg sweep. So sometimes I've never had this come up in a run-of-the-mill conversation with a run-of-the-mill person, but again, maybe someone who's more into philosophy or something might bring up the idea that, yes, there are objective morals, but sometimes they just call them brute facts. So essentially the idea is there are objective morals and they're just self-existent, sort of like mathematics and laws of logic. Okay, so again, mathematics are these immaterial ideas, right, that are universal, and so are the laws of logic. And again, if you deny a creator, then they just have to be self-existent. So they just claim that objective morals are just self-existent, like math and laws of logic. And again, I'm not going to go into long explanations or refutations of these, but essentially that's really not an explanation. It still doesn't tell us where these things come from. And the other thing, I asked a philosopher, someone with a philosophy background about this, and he pointed out that things like mathematics, laws of logic, and therefore objective morals that are just proof facts would be causally impotent, meaning there's no obligation or moral duty to follow them. So if they're just brute facts, like I said, why do we have to obey them, Another issue, this was brought up in that book we were reading, God's Crime Scene. If evolution is true, what are the chances it would randomly create creatures who can understand and live these self-existent morals? So that's an interesting question to pose if someone does give you the brute facts explanation. Now, usually the way, if I get the person to admit that, yeah, there must be some objective morality, the next question I usually ask is, what is the best explanation then? So instead of me just laying out the moral argument and saying, therefore God, you have to believe in God, I'll say, well, what is the best explanation for that? Is the best explanation is they just exist? Because like I said, that's not even really an explanation. That's just kind of, you know, I don't know what that is, but it's not an explanation, right? But if we think about it, if moral laws exist, objective moral laws are objective, they're universal, they're also immaterial. So that would point towards a lawgiver that's moral, that's intelligent, right? Because only intelligent beings have morals, right? We don't put tigers on trial for killing a deer, right? The lawgiver must have personhood, must have, personhood, transcendental and immaterial, right? So taken into that account, it points towards the God of the Bible, at least as a credible explanation. All right, two other little techniques or whatever you want to call them that I have just to keep in mind, both are biblical. One is the pearls to pig concept, which is essentially in Matthew 7. Jesus talks about don't cast your pearls to pigs. And when you read it in context, essentially, and this seems very un-Jesus-like, or at least popular caricatures of Jesus, he's essentially telling you, don't waste your time with certain people. I mean, that's how I've come to understand it anyway, that that sometimes you just have to, realize, sometimes it's the conversation's just not going anywhere, and maybe the person's not looking for an honest discussion. So, again, I don't really do this anymore, but a few years ago, I would engage with atheists online that I didn't know, had no relationship with whatsoever. And if they just started off by insulting me or calling me names, it became pretty clear that they really didn't want to have any sort of honest discussion. So it's really just, I got better things to do. So that's essentially what I mean by the pearls to pig. Be a good steward of your time and realize whether someone's really looking to have an honest discussion or not. And sometimes they aren't. And sometimes you just have to decide, like, hey, this isn't the best use of my time, and just say, just bow out. Another, like I said, for lack of a better word, technique that I've used is I try to appeal to the image of God in the person. Again, like finding some common moral ground you can both meet on and say, like, listen, I know this is important to you. And I can even hear some of the anger in your voice when you talk about it, or the emotion in your voice when you talk about it. And I'm right there with you. But I, sincerely don't think that your worldview gives us grounds for that. But I believe in a God of justice, and you could point them to the Bible and why this is important to you as well, and that you have the philosophical grounding for these beliefs in the God of the Bible. So I've had some conversations that gone like this. So basically we start talking about whether objective morals exist. The person says no. I essentially pull out is it ever okay to torture a baby for fun statement or something like that. If the person says no, then you go to, well, what is the best explanation for that then? Like for objective moral standards. And if they say, do the brute facts route, again, I just usually end up there. And like I said, I'm not a black belt in this stuff. So this is just based on my experience. If they say yes, like I said, they essentially say, yes, there are times where torturing babies for fun might be morally good. There's really, two ways you can go, kind of the high road or the low road. The low road is essentially the pearls to pigs, where if this person's, they're just not, they're very combative, or it's just, you're just seeing that it's just going to be a waste of time. You might point out the absurdity of their worldview. So sometimes if people are listening in, I've heard apologists who do debates talk about this. And actually, I've even heard street evangelists talk about this, where they say sometimes when you're not there for the person you're debating, you're there for the people listening in, right? So if there's people listening in, and it's pretty clear, likely this person isn't going to change their view in front of an audience, or, and these things aren't, let's be honest, most times people aren't going to suddenly say, no, you're absolutely right, right? It's going to take them a while to chew on things. But if you, you might just say something like, okay, you heard it. This man or woman just admitted that sometimes it is morally good to torture babies for fun. And I just want to point out to all of you that the absurdity of their worldview. Their worldview has brought them to this point where they believe that torturing babies can sometimes be morally good. Now, again, that's if things are pretty combative. Like, again, as followers of Christ, we want to avoid that. We want to, show grace. We want to build relationships. We want to, keep the conversation going. But again, there's times where you just realize there's really no point to continue this conversation. Now, the better road, if you can, is to appeal to the image of God in the person and just say, listen, I truly don't believe you really believe that. And just, try to get very human with them, instead of keeping it in debate mode. Now, Greg Koukl, again, the writer of the book Tactics, which is very useful, he has this phrase called the steamroller, which is something essentially when someone is really aggressive with you, like they're just going on this long rant, they're not letting you get a word in edgewise. When you do start talking, they cut you off. And again, if you want to look up something, he's got some videos, and again, his book's highly recommended, where he just talks about how to handle someone. He calls them the steamroller, and it's just, again, being polite and saying things like, hey, listen, do you want to have an honest conversation? Are you good? Because if we are, then you're going to have to let me respond once in a while without being interrupted. Are you willing to do that? And, if the person says yes, and you start talking and they keep doing it, eventually you might just say, well, listen, I pearls to pigs, essentially, like, listen, I just don't see any use in continuing this conversation because you don't have any respect for me to let me talk to you. So that's one way that he recommends. Another way is to simply say, well, you just laid out a whole bunch of things. Can we just tackle them one at a time? And kind of go from there, because sometimes they just dump truck on you. They just dump a whole bunch of stuff on you. And like I said, you don't even have time to respond. Now, when it comes to, I had to put Mike Tyson there. When it comes to the moral debate, I call this, again, I just came up with goofy titles. So I was listen, if you're not entertained by this, I was at least entertained while I was making the slideshow. But essentially the question, according to what, and essentially what you're asking is, according to what standard, right, are you making these moral claims? So again, if, essentially this little thing I put here is the Richard Dawkins rant, and the person's just going and going, and you just want to put a stop to it. I mean, you really just ask, like, according to what? Like, where do you get this idea of racism and misogyny, and where do you get this idea of genocide's wrong? Like, so before you go condemning either my faith or the God of the Bible, or condemning this morally, or you need to explain to me, where does your morality come from? Okay, so now again, that could be used in a situation where the person is being extremely aggressive, but hopefully you can use it in a more gentle way, the gentle Mike Tyson. So to give you an example of one time, I had this guy just like railing against Christians and the God of the Bible. And so I asked him, I said, so where do you get your morality from? Like, according to what? Like, according to what standard are you making all these judgments? And he just kept going. So I did like the for fun leg sweep variation. I said, tell you what, I'll make this, because this guy was being extremely aggressive. I said to him, tell you what, I'll make it easy for you. Just explain to me why stabbing babies is wrong. Okay, now I understand that sounds harsh, but like I said, this man was being extremely aggressive. So I said, just explain to me why stabbing babies is wrong. And he would rant, and I said, wait a minute, you haven't answered anything I said. You just keep ranting. Explain to me while, again, stabbing babies is wrong. And what he actually said was, oh, it's complicated. So, and at this point, there was no, long before this point, there was no reason to really continue the conversation. He wasn't interested in having a conversation. He just wanted to beat up on somebody. So essentially, I just said, all right, well, there's no reason to keep talking to you, and just ended it. And now in a more friendly conversation I had with a friend of mine, again, he was going on quite a bit about like all these issues he has with Christians and the God of the Bible. And in a much more gentle sense, I just simply asked him, like, okay, I'm hearing a lot of moral claims from you, but where do you get these ideas from? Where do you ground your moral claims? And then, we discussed it for a while, and I kind of laid out, well, you believe, this and this and this. So where do you get morality from that? And, and then I used the more appeal to the image of God appeal to him, where I'm like, listen, you're my friend. I know you feel very strongly about these moral things. And I'm telling you that my worldview and my belief in God gives me the groundings for, standing for justice and being against, these things. Let's talk about some alternatives, that maybe a non-believer brings up on where morality comes from. And again, this is not from me doing extensive research. It's really mostly just from conversations, and my responses tend to be questions. So again, this isn't a rigorous like defense or refutation of any of these, but a big one is that culture or society create morals. They're social constructions. So I usually ask questions, well, what part of society then decides that? Must we reach a cultural consensus before we can make a moral judgment? And is the majority always right? Has there ever been a society with immoral values? I like asking this: were Gandhi and Martin Luther King immoral? Because essentially they were social reformers. They were standing against the majority. So that would mean if the majority of the culture decides what's morally good, then they were immoral for standing against that, right? So these are the sort of questions that come up for me when I'm talking to someone about, and they're claiming, well, society makes it. And really, when you get down to it, it's just subjectivism on a larger scale. Okay, so one culture might say slavery is okay. Another one says female genitalia mutation is barbaric. Another one says everyone should have equal opportunities. Another one says coexist. Why? We're the master race. Now, so there might be societies, that you agree with some of their values, and other ones you disagree. But when you really get down to it, it's all just subjectivism again. Really, it's just the people in that culture's opinions, and then we're kind of free to just dismiss them. Like, well, why should I care? According to what? Another alternative I often hear is evolution, that, through the long process of evolution, we've developed these morals and they help us survive. So survival is very close to the, this explanation of evolution. So we're going to talk about both. But first of all, objective morals are, again, these immaterial things, right? So how can a strictly physical, mindless system create immaterial moral ideas? And again, you can point out that evolution is strictly a physical process, and you can also point out it's a mindless process. And again, morality is only done by intelligent creatures. Also, you can ask a question like, the ultimate goal of evolution is procreation, so therefore rape should be moral, right? Like, I mean, if I'm just here to pass all my genes, I mean, I should be trying to pass all my genes as much as possible, right? If you know what I mean, with as many people as possible, right? William Lane Craig also pointed out this in On Guard, his book. If our moral beliefs have been shaped by evolution, then we can't have any confidence in them, because evolution aims not at truth, but at survival. Our moral beliefs will be selected for their survival value, not for their truth. Now, closely related to that is sometimes I hear people say, well, whatever helps us survive is morally good. And again, that's closely connected to this idea of they arose from evolution. So here's the problem. What if it comes down to my survival over yours? So me killing you, like if it was, came down to, we both dying of something and the medicine is right in front of us and there's only enough for one of us. I mean, me killing you would be morally good because it would help my survival, right? What if rape, cannibalism, and slavery helped us survive, right? All those things could help certain cultures flourish in some way, if you think about it. I mean, so does that make those things morally good if they do help people survive? Hopefully you would all answer no. Right. So I think what we can kind of sum up this when we talk about morals coming into being, based on evolution or survival, really it just comes down to selfishness, right? It comes down to my own personal survival being what guides me. And again, I wouldn't say that means it's specifically morally good. I could do some pretty horrible things to make sure I survive or my family survive. So I've had some conversations that go kind of like this. So they use evolution or survival as the grounds for morality. So you say if whatever helps me survive is morally good, then give an example of doing something horrible in order to survive. And a lot of times I call it again, I made up these silly nicknames just for the presentation, but the dictator, where essentially I say, well, essentially if I can become like a dictator, like the dictator of North Korea, and I can essentially like enslave like a bunch of people and have them all under me, and I survive, I'm living great, and everybody under me is horrible. I mean, then that's morally good, right? Because that's helping me survive. I'm doing great. Why do I really need to be concerned with everybody else? Usually, if you see on the left, I get a response that, again, lack for a better word, I just call atheist karma, where essentially they say, well, yeah, I guess you could do something like that, but eventually it's going to catch up with you, and like everybody's going to revolt and kill you. Where if I give a smaller example, I say, well, whatever helps me survive is morally good. So again, if I murder someone to get, that pill that's going to help me survive or to get some food, then it's morally good. And then they'll say something like, yeah, but eventually you'll get arrested and be put in jail, or someone's going to get revenge on you. So it's kind of like, notice it's not whether the action is morally good or not. It comes down to whether I get away with it or not. So that's why I have the Scooby-Doo there. So again, this is an old school reference, but the old Scooby-Doo show, someone would always say, I would have got away with it if it wasn't for your snooping kids. So essentially, I point out to them, so essentially what you're saying to me is, as long as I get away with it, I'm okay. Like, it's morally good. So again, it kind of, I'm trying to lead them to the to a conclusion. I have had, people tell me everything we do is selfish. There really is nothing that we do. Everything is for our survival. It's selfish one way or another. When I look at God's word, John 15:13 tells us, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down their life for his friends. And honestly, that actually helped me come up with what I call two soldiers, one grenade, where essentially talk about two soldiers walking through, just pick a location, walking through a jungle, and a grenade lands between them. And essentially, one of two things could happen. Either one of the soldiers grabs the other and throws his brother in arms on the grenade, and his brother dies, but he survives. Or the one guy jumps on the grenade and sacrifices himself and saves his brother in arms. And I point out that in this situation, we would consider the one a hero and the other one a coward. Yet in a atheistic evolutionary worldview, especially if it's based solely, our morals are based solely on survival, the one who grabbed the other soldier and threw him on the grenade to save his own life was making the logical right choice, right? but there's something beautiful that we notice, that we all agree on, when someone sacrifices himself for others. And it's important, just a quick little side note, it's important when you use this illustration to make it just two soldiers, because originally I would say, you know, a group of soldiers were walking, and then they would say, well, you know, he sacrificed himself for the good of the survival of the larger group. So I kind of eliminate that by making it just two soldiers. Sorry, this is going kind of long, guys. I'm sorry. All right, so then again, another response is, you know, the evolution survival. I say, well, whatever helps me survive is morally good. I give an example, you know, I might use the dictator example. And then, again, this is kind of jokingly, hopefully I'm not coming across as a jerk, but they say the hippie evolution kind of response, which is, well, you know, evolution has led us into understanding that cooperation leads to us surviving and human flourishing. Okay, so now I'm not going to get into a big discussion with the person about evolution. You know, evolution, you know, the model is that the weak die off and the strong thrive. So that's why I kind of jokingly call it hippie evolution, where all of a sudden evolution is like, no, it's about cooperation. And it very well might be both, right? In the evolutionary model, where sometimes cooperation helps us survive and sometimes the weak dying off helps us survive. Another thing is, as Christians, we should be perfectly okay with the idea of cooperation leads to human flourishing. I would say that's a biblical truth, that we're supposed to work together and care for each other, and we want the best for humankind and for the planet, and we want people to flourish. So we're not going to argue that point, because, I mean, for the most part, we're okay with it. But again, it pretty much comes down to the question, well, you know, the Scooby-Doo, if I can get away with something, then is it, you know, morally bad? So yeah, maybe cooperating with each other does help us survive. Again, I don't have an issue with that. But again, if I can do something underhanded and like stab someone in the back to steal from them, and I get away with it and helps me flourish, I mean, again, can you really say that's morally bad based on, you know, we're just looking for, you know, survival and human flourishing? Again, you know, I'm mostly concerned about my own flourishing, not other people's flourishing. And we might talk about, well, we want to do what's best for everybody. But again, that's sneaking in a moral assumption. Why do we have to care about what's best for everybody? All right, this is really quick wrap-up stuff. Some other things I've often heard: whatever leads to the most human flourishing. I already addressed this. Where do you get this idea of human value to begin with? Why human flourishing? Why not the flourishing of sand crabs or moss? Whatever makes people the most happy. Happiness is clearly not a good standard for morality. I could do a lot of horrible things that could make me happy. You know, hopefully not me as a saved believer, but you know what I'm saying. Hypothetically, people can do a lot of really horrible things that would make them happy. I want what's the best for my kids, you know, but then the question is, well, why ought I care about your kids? I make my own meaning. And again, if their worldview is about we're just this random time and chance and eventually everything's going to fizzle and die, that's not meaning. That's just you having a delusion that you think there's meaning. So some final street fighting tips. Remember what Mike Tyson said: everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So that's my way of telling you to be humble. Okay, remember 1 Peter 3:15. Do this with gentleness and respect. Again, some of these techniques are pretty good if someone's being very aggressive with you, but I hope that it's more of a situation where you're having a conversation with a friend and you use these in a gentle way. Right? We want to carry ourselves where those who revile our good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. And Jesus said, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, right? So we want to be wise and innocent. We want to bring God glory. Us being jerks for Jesus does not bring God glory. We also don't want to win the debate but lose the person, right? We want to keep the door open for more conversations. Some final, I think, Mariah, you brought this up, and it's just such a big thing that the sexuality debates of nowadays, it's really hard to have that discussion with someone who has a very different worldview. So honestly, unless the person has a Christian worldview, it's very hard to find any common ground on this topic. So instead, I would use the gentle Mike Tyson. There's happy young Mike Tyson. You never want to be around an angry Mike Tyson, where you just essentially, someone brings up maybe objections to the Christian view of sexuality or sex, and instead push it back and say, instead of talking about that specific topic, push it back to, well, that's an interesting, thing you bring up, but, really what we're talking about is morality. So where do we get our morals from? Where is our moral grounding? So I would push it back to that discussion instead of trying to address those specific things, because like I said, if they don't have a biblical worldview, there's really no common ground we can meet on to talk on those topics. All right, the judo throw. Here's a question. And again, I used this once when someone was being pretty aggressive. What does the atheist worldview have to offer a child with cancer? Christina reminded me of this. I shared this with her a while ago, and she brought it up to me the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. But yeah, the guy was being very aggressive and condemning God for allowing kids to have cancer. And so I asked him, I said, well, listen, my worldview, I believe in a God who came down and died for the sins of the world so they can live for eternity with God. So he actually did something about the suffering in this world, and I can give that child a message of hope. What can you offer that child? So it's a very direct question, but it's a very, very honest question. Then the takedown, and Voss, when he gives his problem of evil talks, he does a great job of emphasizing this, that when you get down to it, when you look at everything we just talked about, evil is actually evidence of God. Because there has to be some standard that we can judge what is good and what is evil. Without that standard, there is no evil and there is no good. It's just like Dawkins said, it's just blind, pitiless indifference. So we'll just close with C.S. Lewis, since he has a good quote for everything. He was an atheist once. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?"